Bienvenidos. This is the Paseo podcast. My name is Joshua Smyser-DeLeon, founder and host of the podcast. Thank you for listening or watching this, wherever, whenever you are. We have JL Torres on the show. He's a Puerto Rican writer, educator, diasporican. So JL Torres, welcome to the Paseo podcast. What should our audience know about you?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on your podcast. Wow, I'm 66, so there's a lot of life there that I can talk about, but to squeeze it into a couple, like a minute. Basically, I'm a diasporican. I'm a child of the Puerto Rican diaspora, and that pretty much defines everything I do. I've been a teacher, educator at the higher, education level for 40 years. I just retired. All that time too, a good portion of that, I've been a writer. I have 4 books out that deal with that diasporican experience, but I'm also a husband for 34 years. I have 2 wonderful sons. And, what I write about mostly is that in-betweenness of not really necessarily feeling Puerto Rican or American. Mm-hmm. And that's really what guides everything that I do creatively.
Yeah. Really leaning into the saying, neither de aquí, neither de allá, like just
right.
kind of that in-betweenness. And that's why I really appreciated you or us connecting really for this episode, because speaking of the 4 books you've written, one of them, your latest, Migrations, I actually have a copy right here for people just listening. I've been reading through some of these short stories, and I definitely want to ask you about one in particular regarding Roberto Clemente, who I think is the best baseball player of all time in all of history.
You get our agreement on that.
Right. But before we get into my questions about that short story, tell us just about the book Migrations. Give us a high-level view. What can people expect when they read it?
Well, I hope that they can find it enjoyable, the stories, that they can also, it can be thought-provoking after they read the entire collection, because the collection is thematically connected in many ways. It's historically bound to Puerto Rican events and moments that I felt were not necessarily like big historic moments, but some nonetheless that had impact on Puerto Ricans. So I would hope that by the end, if you happen to be, I always believe I write for 2 audiences. One is the Puerto Rican audience, whether it's in Puerto Rican Island, or the diasporican audience, and also mainstream. So if you're mainstream and you don't really know much about Puerto Rico, I think you're going to learn a lot more about Puerto Rico, besides being beautiful and sort of a tourist attraction. And then for, my people, I hope that they read it, first of all, and that they understand, at least from this particular Puerto Rican, my sense of what things, how things happen and why these things are important. All at the same time, I'm dedicated to craft, so I'm hoping I'm writing good stories that people just read and enjoy. So,
well, speaking about stories that people read and enjoy, I really enjoyed the story you had on Roberto Clemente. It's that part of your book, that chapter is Clemente Burning. I would love for you to just shed a bit of light on why you chose to center a story on Clemente.
Okay. Well, first of all, I got to make very clear, and I don't think you know this,
please,
Josh, but this is the beginning of a novella. That's what it is. Wow. And I started, writing the novella, and then I said, well, this first sort of part of it can be sort of a short story, and then I included it in the collection. And for this also reason, if ever got published, we would talk about it, I can say this is a novella. So down the line, people will look forward to the novella. So this is a novella that's sort of in the primary process. And the part that you read really is at the moment that he dies, right? We all know that he died in a tragic accident flying humanitarian aid to Nicaragua, Managua. And so from that moment, I want him to be going through this journey to finally, in my opinion, take us also a journey as Puerto Ricans, to through sort of an understanding about race issues when it comes to Puerto Rico. Because I think when it comes to Caribbean people, Puerto Ricans also, we have a different kind of racism. This is what I'm exploring here. It's a kind of racism that's no, pero tú sabes, yo no soy negro, yo soy puertorriqueño, and I'm looking at this person and they're as dark as they can be, but and or I say I'm a person of color, and I've had white people tell me, well, you're kind of light skinned. I don't know, what do you, and even taking umbrage, like you think you're like Really? So I'm like, wow, if you were Caribbean and Puerto Rican, I don't think you would find that hard to believe. But nonetheless, this issue with racism, who else is better to take us through that journey, a narrative journey, than Clemente, who, when he, as in the short story, right, some of the Black players says, dude, you're Black. And he's like, well, I'm not Black like you. And I can imagine that could be an insult to a Black African-American because you think you're not Black, but is he saying really on one part that I'm not African-American? But I don't think that he had the same kind of terminology, vernacular kind of language to deal with race that we have today, right? So in many ways, Clemente in that way, because he was living in 1970 when he died, in 1960s, and he was born earlier, Puerto Ricans have a different kind of language to deal with race that sort of deflects the racism, right? It's very subtle, and es un negrito perfilado. That's what he was, and kind of whitewashing people. It's really, it's really insipid, isn't it? And it's really bad. So this is what I'm exploring with this book, really, our issues with racism. And hopefully by the end, as you know in the story, he meets Alfonso Schomburg. So I have him meeting this person. I have Roberto Clemente talking to Schomburg in the very first part of this, and he's going to go and speak to other illustrious Afro-Puerto Ricans along this journey as he's trying to feel and self-realization and figure out who he is as a Black man. And that's really the core of that work that I'm working on.
Let's talk a little bit about other stories in your book. Which one of the short stories in Migrations do you feel resonates with you the most?
Oh, that's easy to answer, honestly. It's The Operation. Without a doubt, and for your listeners and viewers, this is a story based on the sterilization program they had in Puerto Rico, sterilizing women from, I would say, probably the 1930s, really on. Probably it became a law really later on, and it went all the way to the 60s, late 60s, early 70s. Even with the colonial government, even after Luis Marin. Muñoz Marin was a governor, Puerto Rican governor. They still had it, and it was really a eugenics sort of based program. I mean, it has its roots in that. But the official word that we're trying to, kind of curtail the overpopulation in Puerto Rico. As if somehow you're going to solve all the poverty, all their problems with that, right? But the problem was that many of these women had this operation done without real knowledge of what was going on. And that happens to Elena, the character in my story. She thinks that somehow they tie the tubes and they can untie them. And eventually that will be the case, right? But back in 1950 something, when she had this, the story takes place in 1950s or so, that was not the case. And they weren't really upfront with her. And that's part of the story. And the reason why it resonates with me is I did a lot of research for not only the story, the whole book, because a lot of the book is involved with a lot of history. And so I was reading this history on this, whatever, and then it just hit me. I mean, it was like a shock of, like, my God, I think my mother went through this. That was what it hit me. And then, because I remember talking to her that she had an operation and it was done in an army base. Because she talked about the doctor who was also, a major, or she referred to him, El Coronel so-and-so, but he was also a medical doctor. And I think maybe as a younger, like maybe I was in my teens, early teens, whatever. I just asked her, Mom, why come I don't have a brother and sister? I was the last one. And she said, well, I had an operation, whatever. And I'm like, but it could have been for something else, right? But and she never went into details, and I never asked her. And she passed away about 5 years ago. And so that just went with her, I don't know now. But I'm reading all this stuff. I'm going, oh my, I did not know about this to the extent. I had heard about it, but I realized the extent of this program. And at one point, some towns like Barcelona was, there was like 70%. That's a small town, but like 60, 70%, something ridiculously crazy of the women were sterilized. And I read also somewhere in my research, and I have to paraphrase this because I don't have the site right here, but that the sterilization, that program really sterilized. It was the highest levels of sterilization of maybe in the world, per capita of the women, the number of people, and it's just really stunning that this could happen, and people let it happen, and thinking that it was serving some good without really educating the women. So it's really horrible, and that resonates with me for sure.
No, definitely. Well, and just the sterilization, the systematic, intentional sterilization of women on La Isla. I think that's something that resonates with people to this day. Even the conversations we have about the medical system, and vaccines. People, there's this natural hesitancy because, well, I trusted the medical system before. What could happen to me if I trusted now? And it just didn't do us any favors in the national discourse and discussion about the medical system as a whole, but even like getting COVID vaccinations. And I think we're trending in a good direction in Puerto Rico, is my understanding. But I do know there was a lot of conversation in Puerto Rican circles where the story of sterilization came up many times. So just really, again, just kind of leaning into this distrust.
Right, absolutely, and rightly so, because we Puerto Ricans have been used as guinea pigs. Let's face it, right? And this all comes down to one basic fact, that we are colonized people. We've been colonized. We've been taken over. So what happens? So when the testing the first pill, where do they test it? They test it in Puerto Rico, Puerto Rican women, right? When they had the first nuclear reactor that was just a prototype, where did they put it? They put it in close to Mayagüez. So imagine if that thing had blown up, or it didn't work. I mean, Vieques, I keep saying this because Vieques is not this little island. Vieques is bigger, larger than Manhattan. Okay, just put that. So imagine if 2/3 of Manhattan were being bombed. Okay, that was what's happening in Vieques. 2/3 of it was using as target practice by the Navy until Puerto Ricans just said, "Basta, yeah, this is enough. We're not going to put in," because a guard got killed.
Yeah, and they're still cleaning up the beaches of Vieques.
Yeah, they're still
still finding mines and abandoned tanks.
And how is it that for all those years there was rebellion, there was resistance? I mean, the fishermen particularly destroying our way of life here. We're fishermen. We depend on these waters. They wouldn't listen. And this is the power of a country like the U.S. to do whatever they want with us. And until we decide we're done with this crap. But it's tough, because with colonization comes a certain mindset that is very hard to break out of. And that's the first thing you gotta break out of that mindset, to be able to then say, you know what, you might be the biggest power in the world, but we have the right towards self-determination, and we're going to resist any way we can. I mean, obviously we can't take you on militarily, but we definitely could do it in other ways if that's what the people choose to do. Because certainly there's some people that say, I don't want to deal with that. Yeah. A good portion, actually, unfortunately, sad.
Yeah, well, you touch on a good point. I mean, Puerto Rico is the longest held colony in the world. I mean, it's been a colony of the United States over 120 years strong. I mean, just going.
That's right. That's right.
So, just talking a bit about myself for a second, growing up in our education system, maybe Puerto Rico got 2 pages in my textbook. And maybe that was around the Spanish-American War and how America saved, quote unquote, Puerto Rico from the Spanish. So it's just, again, you're just passing the country from one colony to the next. I mean, who's really saving who? You think about how we talk about education now, and how different state school boards will dictate what gets and what doesn't get in a history book. I mean, just the whitewashing of our history over the past decades, which is why I think having authors like yourself on this show, and even just talking about different books that teach us about our history is so essential, because that's just not something that's baked in to our education system here in the United States. So you have generations of Boricuas that are looking at their own history through one lens that's been told and shaped by a colonizing power, as opposed to by us, for us, which is, again, I'm really happy that we're getting into the democratization of writing. Anybody can kind of do the research and be given that platform and that space to talk about these important topics. But anyway, I don't want to sound like I'm blowing smoke, but I think these discussions are important.
And this is a segue because by the way, the questions that you provide, I excellent questions, and just go segue into that because you sort of touched on that. Why write about like a book like this with history, and about the diaspora, because a lot of people don't know about it, and that's what motivates me to write about this. And I try to find information and kind of topics that I want to write about that have to do with us, our history, our experiences, so that there's a record. You know what I mean? I will never make a lot of money on my writing, but the books are there. And hopefully maybe down the line, some other Puerto Ricans will pick it up and go, oh, look, this guy was writing about this, back then, because I'm not the voice by any means of my people, but I am a voice. And that's what I try to do. I try to be a faithful voice to try to dig into that experience and kind of put it, in some literary way, so that the future generations, your great grandchildren, can maybe read it and figure out this is what was going on with us.
Yeah.
You write this stuff hoping that your people will read it, and then sometimes you wonder if they even know that these books exist, or are they reading it? They want to read it. Do they really want to know about these issues? I don't know, but I hope that they do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've already received one award for the book. So, I mean, there's eyes on this. I mean, and it's even on the cover here. I'm seeing the winner of the inaugural Thomas Rivera Prize. Can you tell us what is that prize?
Okay.
Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, yeah, that is Tomas Rivera, first of all, is not Puerto Rican, but Tomas Rivera was a Chicano, a Mexican American who, his life was basically working as a migrant at a young age, through then getting educated, becoming a professor of literature, and then becoming the first Latino chancellor of UC University of California campus, which is UC Riverside, which was the co-sponsor of this prize, along with the Los Angeles, Review of Books. How fascinating that a writer from the East Coast, Puerto Ricans, wins this award, right? But kudos to them that they basically say this is a Latinx prize, right? I mean, we want to extend to other groups.
Hola, Joshua Smyser-DeLeon here, founder and host of the Paseo podcast. Thanks for listening to the show, where we highlight stories by, from, and about the Puerto Rican community, from La Isla to the diaspora. If you want to help us share the diverse and vibrant stories that make up the Puerto Rican communities here on Paseo Boricua in Chicago and around the world, subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you stream your podcasts. Subscribing helps more people find the show and will help you make sure you never miss an episode. Leaving a 5-star rating and showing some love in the comments helps too. You can also give a donation by looking up the Paseo podcast on savechicagomedia.org. Okay, that's enough from me. Enjoy the show. JL, I did want to go back in time a little bit because you had mentioned after your formal education, you actually went to Puerto Rico to find your roots, find and material for your writing. Again, you really play around with this theme of in-betweenness a lot. So really interested to hear from you. What was that experience like? What did you do to find your roots? And how did living in the United States and living in Puerto Rico influence the way you approach writing about in-betweenness? So it's a loaded question, but
there's a lot there to unpack. But basically, I've lived 1/3 of my life in Puerto Rico. I was born there. Like 5.5 years old, something. My mother took me to New York. I grew up in New York. My formative years were there, and then I went back when maybe I was like 26 or so. I had finished my MFA, not completely. I had to finish my MFA, a collection of stories I wrote. I had to finish that, but I went there and I got a job there, and that started my teaching career. And then I stayed, and then I got married in 1986 or so. My wife is going to kill me. 1987. At the same time, I was going for my doctorate. Don't ever do that. Right? Don't ever do a doctorate and get married at the same time. That is like really too much stress. So I have lived there a good portion of my life. And so what it has done is actually exacerbated really the feeling that I don't belong in either one. That's really what it done. I went back thinking, I'm going to really settle I'm going to, I'm going to help my country be independent in a sovereign state. I'm going to, I was PPOLA all the way and all this stuff. And then it just made me realize I don't belong here either. That's really what it was. And so out of that experience came my novel, which is The Accidental Native, which is about the only book really written in English or Spanish, about reversal migration, Puerto Rican going back to the island, or New Rican going back to the island. And that's another book. I mean, where's the readership? I mean, why, that's the only book that actually delves into that issue of what it feels like to go back and go through that feeling of not really belonging, because the character was even more similar than I am. I mean, his name is Rennie, and he is just René, and he's just way assimilated, and he comes back, and if you read the information of the book, you'll know why he came back. But that really, and I wrote that much later after I was 20, 27, 28. But I kind of tried to put myself in place back then when I was 27, 20, going through all the stuff that I went to. It just made it clearer to me that I'm in that hallway. I'm really stuck in the hallway between the two rooms, and I can't seem to, whether I go into one room or the other, I always feel like I'm in the hallway. And I feel like that's really, really where I belong, So, and what does that feel like is really a good question that I keep trying. I go over and over and over and over again and try to, and I will probably, that will be my main theme that keeps me, going, because we're not like typical immigrants. We don't leave the homeland and forget about it, because the homeland is one plane away. And frankly, it's not really a home. I mean, it's a homeland, but it's not really a nation that, it's like an open door. Mm-hmm. And so there's Puerto Ricans living here, and it's like it's amorphous is what it is. So I think that is really why it's such an important theme to me, because I don't have all the answers. And for me, one of the reasons, and I tell my students this all the time, one of the reasons why we write is to answer questions for ourselves. Whether it's, what really is my true identity? If I don't have an identity, is that a bad thing? Does that mean that, I'm not self-realized in any way? Or is there a piece missing that I will never get back? And if it's true and I come to that conversation, what does that mean for me? Right? It's always a question, or that, or what is Puerto Rican racism like? Which is the answer to the question I'm asking, and I'm trying to answer to the Clemente Burning book.
First of all, appreciate the transparency and the honesty in that response, because I think a lot of people can relate to that. Just a quick story of my mother. I remember growing up and her telling me of, she definitely fell into that category growing up her whole life. She'd live years in Puerto Rico, live years in Chicago, bounce back from the island to the States a number of times, would switch schools. And mentioned, going back to Puerto Rico after being in Chicago for a number of years, going to school there and being called a gringa. And you look at me, I'm more light skinned. I'm more light skinned Boricua. And that's really because my dad's more light skinned. You look at my mom, she looks like she could be Taino. I mean, she's like super, super dark. Or at least has like African, there's the African roots are a bit stronger. So I just remember her kind of like telling these stories later in life, but the way she would articulate that experience, it felt as though she had just experienced it. Like it just sticks with you. Really this idea of being too Puerto Rican for the Americans, but too American for the Puerto Ricans. And you're like in this weird limbo. And actually, I think this is a really good segue to my last question for you, because this very similar discussions were happening around the Tokyo Olympics with Jasmine Camacho Quinn bringing to Puerto Rico, was that second ever gold medal, ever gold medal. Like this is a huge accomplishment. And yet you see some of the chatter online basically calling her out and calling her Boricua card into question because she wasn't born in La Isla, or she doesn't speak Spanish fluently. Why didn't she just represent the United States? Is she really truly Puerto Rican? As if there's this barometer, this meter that says, okay, you checked off all the boxes. You're officially Puerto Rican. She's she's also has darker skin too. So it goes to that point about that racism, right?
Absolutely.
The microaggressions, the covert ways that racism is expressed and seeps into Puerto Rican culture. Again, not to say that that's exclusive to Puerto Rican culture, but it does exist. To your point, it exists differently than it does here in the United States. So with people calling her out and questioning her Boricua card, I really wanted to ask all of our guests that come onto the show this season, what does being Puerto Rican mean to them? So JL, I'm going to throw it back to you. And that's another, I've been throwing loaded questions at you this whole interview, but that's another loaded one, in your opinion.
I don't know if we have enough time. Because I'm like, in my
I know.
I'm trying to figure that out.
Freaking book. Yeah, no, totally. But, in the best way you can, what does being Puerto Rican mean to you?
I'll give a personal, very personal. I mean, I think it's about confusion. It's about frustration and pain in many ways. It's about anger, and not kind of pinpointing why do we have to live this way? Why is it that we live in this kind of amorphous state? And I know why, little by little, because we're colonialized people. But at the same time, it's all those things I mentioned. You're going to have to deal with. You're going to have to deal with the anger and the frustration, whatever. Because really, where's the solution? The solution, really, we know, lies in the hands of the people of power in Washington, D.C. And all we can do is agitate if we really want to solve this problem, So until we resolve that problem, we're going to continue dealing with these questions. It makes it harder to, first of all, there's no such thing as one type of Puerto Rican. That is the most stupid, ignorant thing anybody can even say. There are many types of Puerto Ricans, just like there are many types of, French people. I mean, it doesn't, this idea comes from a lot of people who live over there that have these complexes about being Puerto Rican themselves. And they themselves are so assimilated, they don't realize that they're assimilated. And then they try to throw it back at us like, oh, you're not, it gives them a sort of a sense of superiority, Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking, see, the question you asked was, because they might not speak English or Spanish, or they weren't born there. In my case, I speak Spanish fluently. Okay, yo no tengo ningún problema con el español. Right? I mean, I can read it. I had a major in Spanish, and so no problem there. And I was born there. Okay, so I go back there, and they still question. So
yeah.
They they call me when I went there when I was younger. They call me Piti Yankee, little Yankee.
Yep.
So, and I have a poem there about that. See that everything that happened, I turn into something creative. But so I don't know that's a long way to answer that question, but it's just a very confusing state of being for me. That's really the best way.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. I think that's that confusion. I think that's a really real response. And that's a big reason why, or one of the big reasons why we started this podcast was, Puerto Ricans are more than just great music, great food. Puerto Rican festival. We're not a monolith. There's so much beauty in who we are as a people. And everybody's journey, at least on this show that we've interviewed, is so different and so unique. And they bring so much beauty and skill and talent into the world. It's just always interesting to see how people take that confusion and channel it and sit with it and try to explore it. I think that's one of the more fascinating things about being Puerto Rican and being in the current state of our island as it stands today.
Right. That's a nice summary. And really, I think we should really be much more, proud of who we are. For a small nation, we have done great things. We have done really wonderful things.
I want to give you some space to share with people how they can keep up with you beyond this episode. Social media channels, website, you name it, whatever you got, throw it at us. What should we know? How do we stay up to date?
My author page, which I constantly try to update and kind of keep up to date, is jltorreswriter.com. They can find me there. And I also have this blog that I really have to give more time to now. And you will find some of my ideas and thoughts and essays and things like that. I'm trying to do more reviews and sort of anything having to do sort of with that nexus between Latinx culture, but also Puerto Rican, and also politics, right, and literature. The combination of all those things, or really cultural production. And that is called Post Barrio Universe.
Puerto Rican writer, educator, and diasporican, J.O. Torres. Thank you so much for being on the Paseo podcast today.
It's been a pleasure, really. Thank you for having me on.